Chapter 1. Shango, a source of African religions. Paganism, voodooism, witchcraft, fetishism, black magic, abya, oledamare are all but a mere sample of the many names relegated to a few of the righteously sacred religions of solely traditional indigenous African origin, according to most European and European American educators, theologians, and general missionaries who believe within themselves that they have been ordained by some god or the other to save mankind from themselves. Although this messianic obsession is in itself disgusting enough, these labels have become more and more extremely offensive to the peoples of African origin who cherish their ancient traditional religious heritage that has survived Asian, European, and European American slavery and colonization. As such, this chapter hopefully endeavors to point out some of the fundamentally indigenous African moral, spiritual, and philosophical concepts in these religions which are unknown to most foreigners, as well as to the vast majority of the sons and daughters of the true Garden of Eden, Alkebulan, which the Greeks and Romans renamed Africa, along with other such nomenclatures. Subsequent to the dawn of Zinjanthropus boisei, approximately 750,000 BCE, and possibly before this date, the indigenous African peoples, the so-called Negroes, Bantus, Bushmen, Hottentots, and others bearing such labels of inferiority status placed upon them by their slave masters and colonizers from Asia and Europe, have been honoring a superior force or being. Sometimes this force or being is expressed in its material sense or in its unseeable unison in the spirit, netherworld, equal to the Christian hell and heaven, Muslim paradise, and Jewish hereafter. Because of the concept of a spirit world in most of the traditionally indigenous African religions, there are also good and bad or evil ancestors and or omens. These could be translated into good and bad angels and devils. Thus, the Christian devil, his satanic majesty, would be as much a god as would be Jesus Christ, Allah, or Yahweh. However, he would be a bad or fallen god. Bad, not in the sense that the ancestor himself would have been obnoxious, but in the order of his past as good or bad things, equivalent to the role of a bad Satan, the devil, or fallen angel with respect to a good Jesus Christ, Jehovah, or Allah. For the African's contention is if God alone can make all things and control all things, including man, then there must be at least one good God and one bad God, or the one God is both good and bad in the same instance. Contrary to most European and European American style Christian dogmatism, which expounds the racist belief that black African, Negro, Bantu, etc., traditional religions are solely visualistic and idealistic, the fact is that most indigenous African traditional religions of pre-slavery and pre-colonial European and European American periods that survived are as fundamentally philosophical and spiritual as the so-called idealistic religions. The natural objects used in said African traditional religious practices to which Christian and Muslim missionaries object serve only to remind the faithful of divine presence, and they are no different in meaning than the exhibition of a Mogan David around a Jew's neck, a crucifix hanging on a Christian's chest, or a Kaaba, black stone from Ethiopia, concealed on a Muslim's person, all of which are natural, materialistic objects to remind them of their gods. Citations of an example of the above remarks are to be found in the libations, sacrificial drinking, still being practiced by the indigenous Africans of traditionally African religions. The extent of this custom is seen in the fact that the greatest of the fathers of the Christian Church, St. Augustine, an indigenous African, the most noted of Christendom's moralists, commented on its usage in religious devotion quite favorably. It is no less sacred, Augustine felt, than the drinking of wine during the Christian's Holy Communion in memory of the Last Supper, or a rabbi taking his sips of wine on the Sabbath eve, Omag Shabbat, Friday evening. Yet, these fundamental mainstays in most traditional indigenous African religious teachings have been employed in the mystery systems of North, East, West, South, and Central Africa more than 3,000 years before the birth of the Hebrew religion, which is thousands of years before the African of Egypt, Moses, supposedly left his homeland on the Nile river banks to resettle the African Jews of Egypt in Canaan. Strange as it may seem, the liberation of Canaan by the Hebrews would be an act of imperialism and of genocide had it taken place in the 19th or 20th century. Nevertheless, the mere fact that people have said that God, Jehovah, ordered this colonization of one group of people he made by another seems to justify said barbarism in the minds of most, even today. If the Egyptians should claim that God ordered them into the same area taken from the Moabites, Hittites, Jebusites, etc., the same as he ordered the Hebrews some time ago, over 3,000 years ago, who will believe them? To say that the indigenous West Africans' involvement in the use of alcoholic beverages, palm wine, for libations, religious invocations, or secular toastings, is the custom of pagans and the uncivilized, which is too often said, is to label equally all Westerners who drink wine ceremoniously in Hebrew or Christian rituals of being guilty of the same. Then is it godly when a white man drinks wine in a church or synagogue, but ungodly in the case of a black man? In voodoo ceremonies, libation marks the period when certain rituals begin and others end. For example, the libation ritual during the ceremony that precedes the placing of sacrificial foods on the main altar, Bagai, Holy of Holies, before the prayer of sacrifice, also marks the entrance of the Papa Loa, high priest. This custom is as common among the African Haitians as it is among the Waidas of West Africa. In Christian ceremonies, especially during Holy Communion, it is customary for the attendants, mass boys, priests, etc., to set the altar with bread, host, in preparation of the recital of a pagan ritual that demands, "Take ye and eat this, Christ's body," etc. For wine, alcohol it is. "Drink ye this, Christ's blood," etc. The priest or minister's first drink, libation, before he dips the host, Christ's body, into the wine, Christ's blood, and calls upon God, Christ's Father, which is similar to invoking the spirit of the Yorubas of West Africa's god, Oladamere, and his Orishas, minor gods. This is clearly stated in the "Take ye this my blood, and drink in my memory," etc., a typically paganistic and cannibalistic ceremony if performed by Africans or African Americans in voodoo. In this ceremony, not similar to the ancient custom when the Druids of Northern Europe allegedly drank their enemies' blood and ate their brains to capture their spiritual and physical strength. Is there any major difference between the practice when the Papa Loa, high priest, who is similar in rank to a Roman Catholic bishop, Protestant archbishop, Jewish chief rabbi, or Muslim grand imam, is aided by his subordinate, priest, and mambo, priestess, at the beginning of the eating of the manjas, sacrificial food, as the Bajian, acolyte or assistant to the high priest, shakes the asan rattle, made from a hollowed gourd with dried corn kernel inside, 3 times, while the members of his congregation respond by bowing their heads, and when a Roman Catholic bishop, in his ceremony during the Holy Communion, or when a priest acts as the bishop's acolyte and shakes the chimer, incense holder, and the chimes signal the congregation to bow their heads in prayer, while in the pursuing moments that follow, the choir softly and solemnly sings as his wine, libation, is carefully poured for him by his acolyte. Bajian. Is the burning of sweet incense in voodoo rituals ungodly, but godly in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic ceremonies? If this is true, then Western religions, incense is the right way, and maybe the choir in their religious ceremonies, with its organ and or piano background music, is also the only one to be rated godly. If Western religions' choirs are the only ones approved by the authorized gods, it is only natural that the voodoo choirs with their background ogun, triangular instruments beaten by sticks, and tambours, series of drums, must be rendered ungodly. Why? Because a group of powerful men, European and European Americans who dominate and control religious propaganda, ordained it so? God, or Vodum, Jehovah, Oladarame, Jesus Christ, Allah, and Babaloa. Neither one is less the divinity that enters and seizes the righteous in a Pentecostal, Baptist, or voodoo ceremony because he or she is called by either one of these names mentioned. In any of the fundamentally so-called saved soul churches of African American and European American sponsorship, one can easily note that voodoo and juju have been co-opted in many of their forms into the Judeo-Christian setting that is common to Christians and Jews in the United States of America. With this phenomenal development, the so-called Negro spiritual is the most common and acceptable paganistic incantation to European American Jews and Christians. Why? Because they see such African incantations, Negro spirituals, as religious entertainment by truly black-faced minstrels, niggers, etc. Are the Negro spirituals in any way a developmental outgrowth of European American style Christianity, or are they not an extension of indigenous African traditional religious chants that underwent European and European American style Jewish and Christian influences? The latter is definitely the case. Of course, this conclusion will be very heatedly denied by those who wish not to be labeled, among other things, pagans, savages, uncivilized, cannibals, etc., but the fact still remains that juju, voodoo, witchcraft, and magic, all basic elements within the so-called Western religions, have been emphasized in the African American, black, owned and controlled synagogues, churches, and mosques. The history of the African Americans' belated entrance into European American style Christian Protestantism and Roman Catholicism is in itself evidence that the Africans, who were at the time shadow slaves of European and European American Jewish and Christian slave masters, were not wanted by the in-groups, the slave masters. Could it have been possible that those Africans who were not aware of the fact that their fellow indigenous Africans, such as Moses, St. Augustine, Bilal, and others, primarily made Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the mass organizations they are, would have adopted the existing forms of religious worship their slave masters were using to enslave them in toto? Not at all so. The mere fact that they were forcibly excluded from all forms of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Western religions, religious worship, and that they were even persecuted and prosecuted for any attempt at practicing either on their own, is further prima facie evidence that there is a distinctly different Judaism, Christianity, and Islam developed by the African Americans that is not attributable and or applicable to and by European Americans. The uniqueness of their common eating habits represents no major differences between the two groups. For example, the African American was forced to develop an appetite for chitterling, ham hock, pig's ears, tails, and feet. Why? Because all other parts of the pig, like all other edible animals, were reserved for the European and European American slave masters, Christian and Jewish, in and out of religion. In the case of the so-called Western religions, the Africans were even denied the right to read any book whatsoever, that is, including the Jewish or Christian Holy Scripture, much less the Muslims, which was not tolerated among the colonists, even after they became independent as the United States of America. One must remember that the Africans, although crushed in their every attempt to participate within the culture of the bestial environment of slavery, did communicate with each other in the cotton fields and other places where they labored, through voodoo, juju, and other richly spiritual and religious devotions they developed in their indigenous homeland, the continent of Al-Kebulon, Africa. The bestiality of the slave masters further made them learn each other's religious songs and chants. This conglomerate of religious exaltation, therefore, became the background for the latter development, which is today erroneously called Negro spirituals instead of African incantations or voodoo chants. It is to be remembered that the slaves were Africans, not Negroes. Negroes were originated by the European slave masters, so was Negroland. See Black Man of the Nile by Yosef ben Jochannon. There was nothing Negro about the development of the spirituals. They were developed by millions of Africans, not one of whom was a free man, not one a citizen, not one a human being under the laws of Great Britain up until 1776 CE. Neither were they so considered after the American War of Independence from Great Britain, nor after their federal constitution was written, and from thence through the 14th Amendment of said document in 1885 CE, and to a very great extent, not even today, in 1970, more than 350 years after the first group of Africans were brought to the United States of America as indentured and chattel slaves. Further proof lies in the fact that Africans on the European and European American slave farms, plantations, or in the businesses and big houses sang their African spirituals and chanted their other voodoo and juju praises to Africa's gods long before they could even understand what the gods of their European and European American captors and slave masters were all about. This European-style Christian God, Jesus Christ, was different to the Jesus Christ presented to them in Ethiopia before he was introduced to the Romans in Rome. Fare thee well, etc., may be to most black and white peoples in the United States of America today some sort of poetically broken English. Yes, certainly poetic, and definitely broken in its English. Yet it came from a Negro spiritual that had its origin in the savagery of the Jewishness and Christianless slave masters' sadistic cruelty and genocide upon their helpless and defenseless African slaves. Fare thee well, that the blows from the master's bullwhip with its metal pellets would not maim another African slave if he or she was not lucky enough to die from the blows instead. This is what these words that were composed during the world's worst era of genocide by one group of mankind's inhumanity toward the other European and European American physical and mental enslavement of the African peoples in Africa, the Caribbean islands, and continental Americas were saying, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go," etc., may in itself suggest Jewish Hebrew origin. Yet, in fact, it was the poetic expression which was so common in the Africans' rebellion of their disgust and contempt for their Christian and Jewish slave masters that were being exalted. But why did the slaves use the name of a fellow indigenous African, Moses, a Harubu, in their appeal for freedom, and could not see the justice in their other fellow African Pharaoh King Ramses II's reason for exiling his fellow indigenous Africans of the Hebrew religion, Jews? Because of many reasons, most common of which are: A. They did not know that Moses was an indigenous African as they were. B. Biblical Egypt had always been taught in churches and synagogues as a mythical place where Africans, whom the slave masters renamed Negroes, did not exist. C. They were brainwashed into believing that the enslavement of the African Jews by their fellow African worshippers of the god Ra was an act against their God Jehovah of the Jews and Jesus Christ of the Christians. But their own slavery, on the other hand, was the will of God. D. And that their own enslavement was for their own benefit, since slavery saved them from being eaten by their much more cannibalistic, uncivilized, pagan fellow Africans, who were not as fortunate as they were to hear the message of God, Jesus Christ. The hatred implanted into the preceding words with regard to Moses and his troubles with his fellow African, Pharaoh Ramses II, is still sung with greater passion in African American churches than songs of their own enslavement, such as Old Man River and Lift Every Voice and Sing. And most of the sophisticated so-called middle-class-minded Negro churches, such as the Negro Presbyterians, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Moravians, etc., these songs seem to be banned by a kind of gentleman's agreement to hopefully bury their historic past memories of chattel slavery. In this manner, the beneficiaries of slavery, their slave masters' descendants, can easily forget the fact that the slave's labor which created said wealth goes still unpaid. Lift Every Voice and Sing, etc., begins the once famous Negro national anthem that was composed by the late African American James Weldon Johnson. However, it is still being sung among the less sophisticated African Americans, blacks, who find no solace in its continued exclusion in European America. But today it too has become a part of the voodoo and juju African American spiritual of the Cultural Revolution. It too has been relegated to be sung only upon occasions when the African American is overshadowed by some white cloud of misery, such as the cold-blooded murders of the minister Malcolm X, El Haj Malik Shabazz, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But it must also give way to the much more popular "When I die, I'm gonna walk all over God's heaven, heaven, heaven," etc., when the fallen brother or sister African American is a close and personal friend or blood relative. Why? Because the latter song preaches resignation and satisfaction with slavery, whereas the former slightly suggests a bit of protest on the part of a people who are still in their state of mental slavery, yet conscious enough to muster a bit of protest in their struggle for self-esteem. Voodoo and juju chants and testimonials can be heard in the preaching of the last Sermon on the Mount that echoed, free at last, great God Almighty, I'm free at last. I've been up to the mountain top, and I've seen the promised land," etc. But with a crashing, booming bang, from an assassin's weapon of violence, the life of the man on the mountain, a byproduct of voodoo and juju, along with European and European Americanized Judeo-Christianity, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was free at last. This man, who had melodiously mastered his African chants, found only in the African American, so-called Negro Baptist Church and other testimonial sharing and soul releasing African forms of Christian experience around the entire world, had also revived voodooism and jujuism, even to the point of provoking the love of the god Oludumare and his Orishas, minor gods. This analysis may not find many believers in its proclamations, but the fact remains that Dr. King was typical in his approach as any voodoo preacher of today. When voodoo priests take a rooster in their divine incantation and begin their dance to the god Dambala Oedo, one can hear the same in the spiritual crescendo of the tambourine and piano playing that accompany the religious dancing within the African American testimonial that Dr. King preached, particularly when Obeah and voodoo spirits take hold of their worshippers, to the extent that they floatingly move into the ecstasy of religious trance. This form of voodooistic involvement has been adopted by thousands of European Americans of varied branches of Christianity, which are today called sects by their much more sophisticated brethren, who prefer to maintain their emotionless, dried-up middle-class analytical teachings of self-proclaimed theologians and philosophers, who teach beyond and above the understanding of their parishioners, mainly to show their academic skills rather than deal with their followers' earthly needs. Soul, this overplayed and maligned exotic word, has been removed from its voodoo origin into an old black magic and witchcraft night-clubbing atmosphere, and from there to the more popular and contemporary but most contemptible meaning of black comedy. Yet soul was the original expression used in the religious ceremonial dance that once entered in a debased form the European American entertainment world from the Caribbean as the limbo dance. The limbo, a religious ceremonial dance performed by the priest of the Obeah rites in preparation for the adoration ceremonies adulating masculinity before the initiation proceedings of a young boy to be circumcised and start his road into manhood, is as sacred as a Jewish bar mitzvah or a Christian first communion. In this ceremonial exhibition, it is said that man displays his greatest sense of power in his ability to coordinate in perfect unison his mind and body in graciously rhythmic movements, and as such reach perfect meditation with his God through the intervention of ancestral spirits from the spirit world. But why did the overlords and slave masters from Europe and Britain ban the limbo in Africa and the Caribbean islands? Because they feared its paganistic immorality and the black magic it was supposed to emit. They saw it as a form of heathenism, of course, with a bit of cannibalism thrown in for good measure. This reaction being typical of the so-called Christian missionaries that afflicted Africa and the indigenous African peoples and their descendants for over the past 476 years, 1503 to 1970 CE. Footnote: 1503 or 1506 CE or Christian era was the year the Right Reverend Bishop Bartolome de las Casas of the Roman Catholic Church had the King and Queen of Spain and the Pope in Rome institute the infamous slave trade, their first victims being Moors who had refused to become Christians after they were toppled by the Christians. The first number to be sent to Las Casas was 4,000. The original slave port was located on the island of Haiti, which the Spaniards had already renamed Hispaniola. End of footnote. In general, that which is presently called limbo dance came down to contemporary African Americans by way of African Christianity, which was adopted after Christianity was infused with Judaism and Voodooism in West Africa and the Caribbean islands before its arrival in the United States of America. Is it not strange that in saved soul or sanctified dancing the dancer's knees are never crossed? Yes, but only to those who do not know that crossing the knees in a voodoo dance is as much sacrilegious as one trying to do a goose step during a Jewish or Christian religious procession before the Ark of the Covenant or the altar of communion. The history of this most sacred religious tradition came down to the African American and the African Caribbean from generations succeeding generations through action, even though not a single word was permitted to be written down, all of which was inspired by God, the African god, Voodoo. One sees the same corollary in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditional religious dances or movements of the priests, rabbis, ministers, and imams. This tradition, the limbo dance, is as much the order of a god of Africa, through his inspired holy prophets that were called upon by his angels, as the gods of Europe and Asia who called upon Abraham, Moses, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad. Or is it that God too is guilty of racism, and that he, she, or it could never call upon an African to be one of the prophets? Maybe it is that Oludamere, the god of the Yoruba and millions more of West Africa, is not the equal of Jehovah, Jesus Christ, or Allah. If the European and European American can see beyond his or her own narrow belief that he alone is perfect, and that mankind did not have to call upon him to save humanity for any god whatsoever, then and only then is it possible for him to see the influence juju, voodoo, magic, abya, witchcraft, and most other forms of other people's religion and God that preceded the creation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam had on them in their own beginning and now. In his book, Bantu Philosophy, the late Roman Catholic priest Placide Temples wrote, In Search of a Bantu Philosophy, 1. Life and death determine human behavior. It has been often remarked that a European who has given up during his life all practices of the Christian religion quickly returns to a Christian viewpoint when suffering or pain raise the problem of the preservation and survival or the loss and destruction of his being. Many skeptics turn in their last moments to seek in the ancient Christian teaching of the West the practical answer to the problem of redemption or destruction. Suffering and death are ever the two great apostles who lead many wanderers in Europe at their last moments to our traditional Christian wisdom. In the same way, among our Bantu, we see the Evoluyu, the civilized, even the Christians, return to their former ways of behavior whenever they are overtaken by moral lassitude, danger, or suffering. They do so because their ancestors left them their practical solution of the great problem of humanity, the problem of life and death, of salvation or destruction. The Bantu, only converted or civilized superficially, return at the instance of determining force to the behavior activistically dictated to them. Among the Bantu, and indeed among all primitive peoples, life and death are the great apostles of fidelity to a magical view of life and of recourse to traditional magical practices. 1. Evo-U. I preserve this term untranslated for lack of a suitable English equivalent. It signifies those who have passed out of the traditional ways of life and thought of their own ethnic group and have taken over those of the West. Herein lies the basic problem in which so many European and European American style Christian and Asian Muslim missionaries and their African converts, also Jewish educators, find themselves hopelessly enthralled. Reverend Temples also tried to be impartial, he said, his claim being the same as all others who professed Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, and at the same instance pretend that their own prejudices can be scholarly subdued sufficiently to make impartial analysis of Africa's traditional religions. This premise is without a doubt ridiculously preposterous, and it is seen in its ugliest pretext by most Africans and African Americans who are most affected by it. How can a person believe in one God and be impartial in his praises of another God of a different philosophy than his own? The possessiveness of Reverend Father Placide Temples is best seen in his claim that, in the same way among our Bantu we see the Evo-U, the quote-unquote civilized, etc. Our Bantu was not even given the usually dishonest treatment of the quotation marks, which would have to some extent concealed the Reverend's personal bias and obvious and apparent racism concerning the word civilized. Reverend Temples opened up his work on the very first page, second paragraph, exhibiting what appears to be the same type of gross racism and religious bigotry his work was supposedly correcting. The title of Chapter 1, In Search of a Bantu Philosophy, is itself at least provocative, if not openly insulting to the overwhelming majority of the peoples of Africa, the indigenous population. Here is a professed man of God who allegedly came to Africa to civilize and Christianize the heathen Africans, yet he had to look for a Bantu philosophy. One can understand the semantic problem because the name Bantu in itself is a creation of the racist colonial slave masters who, like himself, came originally from Europe and later on the United States of America. This type of arrogance caused mass genocide to be committed against the indigenous Africans, the slavers, and colonizers renamed Bantus, along with other names such as Hottentots, Hamites, Pygmies, Negroes, etc. But Reverend Placide Temples was very well aware of this part of history with respect to his fellow colonialist administrators and European-style Christian missionaries with whom he served, and those that preceded him, all of them knowing too well the correct names the indigenous Africans called themselves when they first arrived in Africa. Nevertheless, they forced the Africans to adopt what they chose to call Christian names, such as James, George, Philip, and other such names used by British and European kings, who were some of the worst characters in world history. Any group of people with a concept that created a God which they have not seen, spoken to, or met must have begun from a philosophical premise. This is seen in the mysteries the Jews, Hebrews, copied from their fellow Africans of Egypt, Sais, to produce their first Torah, which the Christians subsequently copied from the Jews to create their Holy Bible, all versions, and the Torah and Bible the Muslims later adopted from the Christians and Jews to produce their Quran. At least, the philosophy Father Temples could not find in his Bantu God, or gods, is uniquely original to any of the so-called Western religions. It was developed along with other traditions and experiences the indigenous Africans had rather than upon European and European American style Christian doctrines which had nothing in common with West, South, or Central African civilizations before the European white man arrived at these areas of Africa. Al-Kebulan. On the other hand, Jack Mendelson, a Unitarian minister, in the second preface of his book entitled God, Allah, and Juju, used an entirely different approach in 1962 than Templars did in 1954. He opened on pages 9 and 10 with the following remarks. I accept African independence without reservations. This is my bias, and it is well to state it at the beginning. I acknowledge also without reservations the equal dignity of Africans. I believe that Africans are under no more obligation to justify their freedom and dignity than Westerners are, nor are they under any less obligations. We, Africans and Westerners, are of the same species. In practical terms, the outcome of African freedom will depend on many forces, some of which are purely African. Others, however, are much influenced by Western sentiments, conduct, and relations with Africa. A good many of these forces are political and economic. They are written about profusely, but politics and economics are not the only forces shaping Africa's future. Religion is also a factor to be reckoned with, a vitally important one. Little enough has been written about it, especially in the broad fashion of this book. Questions of profound significance for Africans and for the sentiment of Westerners about Africa are: what is the future of Christianity as the religious commitment of Africa's rising leadership? What is the future of Islam in the same context? What normal base do African elitists see being built under the newly independent societies? What do African intellectuals mean when they appeal to traditional African spiritual values as such a base? If magic is an inherent part of such traditional values, how does it affect moral and intellectual development? What kind of religious and moral training does the African intelligentsia advocate as part of the educational process? What does the concept of the separation of church and state mean in modern African society? How does religious commitment relate to the overall style of life of African leaders? What vital relevance is there, if any, in the traditional African structure of time, the unseen spirit world? How does all of this relate to the allure of communism as an alternative spiritual force? Before commenting on Mendelssohn's preface, it is necessary to cite what he had to say in his dedication to that small circle of men and women in each African society who hunger for what is essentially African, even as they thirst for the best of the world's learning and modernity. They are still few in number and are having no easy time of it. The small circle of men and women in each African society, etc., which Reverend Mendelssohn knows in his mind are still few in number, is conceivable, but not necessarily true, and needs corroboration. The balance of his statement is just another missionary's conclusion that appears prejudged to suit the pattern of something else dissimilar to that which he wrote in the first paragraph of his preface, shown underscored for emphasis. The extract from the preface, pages 9 and 10, as highlighted by the last question. Thus, how does all of this relate to the allure of communism as an alternative spiritual force? Would it not be logical that the indigenous Africans should now relate more so to their own traditional Juju religion, with its built-in communalism, which is much more highly advanced in terms of human relations than that which is today called democracy, for their own religious solutions? Why is the question, In relation to the Africans' freedom, always communism more than capitalism, Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, including Unitarianism, neither of which is conducive to any of the indigenous African civilizations in existence. Each of these foreign isms has had at least 400 years in Africa, except communism, to prove itself in the eyes of the Africans, and has utterly failed. On pages 21 and 22, Reverend Mendelssohn stated the following: What of the Christian missionary movement? Its slow but steady progress has now run headlong into the New Africa. The charges leveled against it are both humorous and biting. In their freewheeling moods, young Africans never seem to tire of retelling the old chestnut. The missionaries came to us and said, "We want to teach you to pray." "Good," we said. "We would like to learn to pray." So the missionaries told us to close our eyes. We closed our eyes. There was a Bible in our hands, but our land was gone. If the good Reverend believes that this is not true, he should read accounts by his own forerunners in the missionary field, especially The Planting of Christianity in Africa by C.F. Grove, New York, 1948-58, 4 volumes. The Reverend continues, "But there are also bitter words, words repeated endlessly across the breadth of Africa. The Christian missionary movement was an attempt to quench the African spirit. It tried to turn Africans into European Christians. It kicked down our culture to show us which side God is on. Missionaries are unrealistic about polygamy. Wherever the white man still has the upper hand, the missionaries remain strangely tolerant of racial discrimination. The missionaries drag their feet when it comes to training Africans for church leadership and authority. The missions have been indifferent, even hostile toward African nationalism. There's been no real sympathy for the political aspirations gripping young Africans. If Mendelssohn, at this late date in Christian missionary involvement in Africa as an adjunct to colonialism, cannot understand why Africans would turn to any ism other than capitalism and European or European American style Christianism from the above alleged comments, his slumber is very deep indeed. There is not an African old enough to reason who is not aware of the truth in the above charges. Even Africans who have unfortunately joined what is being peddled as Christianity in Africa to this very day by men of the cloth from Europe and the United States of America, the so-called African or native clergy, know these facts. They know that imperialism, colonialism, chattel slavery, and now neo-colonialism were and are partners of European and European American style Christianity. Africa's Tarnished Cross is the name selected by Mendelssohn for the chapter in which the preceding quotations are shown. But should it not be Europe and European America's Tarnished Cross? Why insinuate that the Christian cross, European and European American style, is at all African? The indigenous African peoples did not import this style of Christianity into Africa. It came there with the slave masters and its co-colonialist mate, imperialism, which it now desires to disavow. Why? Because it is too now under attack and being rejected for what it has proven to be, in fact, in the eyes of the Africans and their new nations. Yet Ethiopian African Christianity, formerly the Coptic Church, the oldest Christian church in the world, is still respected and has no tarnished cross. Religion in Africa Today, the subtitle of Mendelssohn's book, follows the usual order in which the traditional religions of Africa have been lowly rated by the missionaries, as shown in the pattern followed in his book's title, God, Allah, and Juju. Since Africa is the main theme or subject of the entire book, why not Juju, God, and Allah? And is Jesus Christ any more a God than Juju and Allah? Furthermore, why should the Africans always follow everyone else? The answer is already shown in the comments that alleged Africans repeated to Reverend Mendelssohn, which he seems not to comprehend. It is seen in its contemptuous accounts by his fellow missionaries who still contend that the Africans who are not taken in by sky pilots who preach death and not life are cannibals, heathens, pagans, one step near man, and the likes of such comments and labels. Commenting on the expulsion of the French Roman Catholic bishop, the Right Reverend Gerard de Milleville, who got booted from the Republic of Guinea August 25, 1962, by President Sékou Touré after he had served 16 years of indulgence and support of French colonialism without once ever opposing it, and 4 years after the people of Guinea, under the leadership of their president, won their independence from France, which he could not adjust to, Mendelssohn stated on pages 165 and 166 the following: this but one more in a continuing line of flaring signals indicating that the Christian missionary enterprise in Africa is in serious trouble. Regardless of how valuable the missionary contribution to Africa has been and might continue to be, the sentiment spreads among African leaders that the effort is no longer appropriate to their continent. One must needs say that Mendelssohn believes that the African leadership at one time or another considered European and European American style Christian missionaries appropriate. He may be surprised to know that they are there not because they were or are appropriate, instead because they were and still are supported by the military might of the nations of Europe that imposed them upon the indigenous African peoples, and that this imposition was used to stomp out many indigenous traditional African religions of thousands of years' duration. He continues, nonetheless, missionaries should not feel despondent about this, say Africans. The intellectual and religious loaves they have cast upon the waters have returned in the form of nationalism and our determination to run our own affairs. In that sense, missionaries have done their job well, and we thank them. Their devotion, including often enough even the sacrifice of their lives, has built schools and hospitals and widened the horizons of our religious beliefs. Still, they must go. Not that the needs of Africa in education, medicine, and spiritual growth are now met. Far from it. Unfortunately, Reverend Mendelssohn did not identify any of the Africans who supposedly made these profound statements of praises for the missionaries. Africans who were not aware of the systems of education in Africa before the coming of the white man from Europe and later the Americas in search of food, medicine, education, and other means of human comforts. But again, the quotation marks act to remove the Reverend's own reactions, apparently only. However, his remarks seem to be in response to President Touré's statement of August 27, 1961, in which he said, "No Catholic prelate will be accredited to Guinea unless he is an African." President Touré's prohibition was rather mild in comparison to the general feeling of other Africans in high positions who have witnessed the courtship and marriage between Christian missionaries and their church to the colonial administrators, and of course to the heads of the various Christian orders in their national headquarters of the national governments to which they pledge unfailing loyalty, while claiming God's, Jesus Christ's, endorsement. This is best seen in the case of all missionary groups, by virtue of the colonial and neo-colonial powers' authority, through force or economic stronghold on the African nations, which are further perpetuated in each case where there is a sanctioned state religion, generally that which the former colonizer set up before leaving physically, of Christianity, European or European American style. As a result, this type of religious structure and the Europeanized Africans who operate them are obligated for continued leadership and control by the former slave masters and colonizers. If for no other reasons, this is one of the major ones which the present leadership prefers not to have continued. Unfortunately, the Reverend Mendelssohn is not the only Christian who wants to see Christianity in Africa at all cost, irrespective of the African's opinion about it. Like most of his colleagues, the missionary sees new hospitals, schools, medicine, and other such material values being of greater importance to the Africans than the price the Africans had to pay for these things. This is providing one is to accept a position that the Africans had none of these facilities before colonialism. It would be foolish to take time in refuting this ancient colonialist Tarzan and Jane type of Stanley and Livingstone mythology. One has to learn that the re-Africanization of African things that were Europeanized for over 400 years also includes the so-called Western religions, and in particular those which are still being passed off as Christianity, which in reality are nothing more than the religious accommodation of what is also called today Western democracy, or the free world system of economic individualism. Again, it is quite unfortunate that the Africans are so much underrated by communists and capitalists alike, each believing that his way is the only way to the answer to mankind's problem, each forgetting that each man, including Africans, can think for himself, and that it was gunpowder, not Jesus Christ, Allah, Jehovah, Marx, Mao, or any other god that made the African slaves for over 400 years. Therefore, the African god Olodumare, once more in the history of Africa, becomes as much a recognized supreme being in Nigeria and other parts of Africa as the gods Jehovah, Allah, and Jesus Christ are elsewhere, and as they were in Africa from the beginning of the infamous slave trade until political independence in Africa, a fact which too many Christian missionaries cannot yet accept. This recognition is actually saying that Olorum is the master of the netherworld, owner of heaven, as much as Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and or Allah. And of course, that he also rules over every man in the universe from his joyous heaven, just as he maintains a wretched spirit world for those that fail Oludumare. Also that Olodumare is the God over all other gods. Yes, this the Africans of this religion hold true, according to their God-inspired men. A noted African scholar and author dealt with this same problem in the following dialogue. You say that there is one supreme God who made heaven and earth, said Acuna on one of Mr. Brown's visits. We also believe in him and call him Chukwu. He made all the world and the other gods. There are no other gods, said Mr. Brown. Chukwu is the only god, and all the others are false. You carve a piece of wood, like that one. He pointed at the rafters from which Acuna's carved Nkanga hung, and you call it a god, but it is still a piece of wood. Yes, said Acuna, it is indeed a piece of wood. The tree from which it came was made by Chukwu, as indeed all minor gods were, but he made them for his messengers so that we could approach him through them. It is like yourself. You are the head of the church. No, protested Mr. Brown. The head of the church is God himself. I know, said Acuna, but there must be a head in this world among men. Somebody like yourself must be the head here. The head of my church, in that sense, is in England. That is exactly what I'm saying. The head of your church is in your country. He has sent you here as his messenger, and you have also appointed your own messenger and servants. Or let me take another example. The district commissioner. He is sent by your king. The above drama took place in the classic work, Things Fall Apart, by Mr. Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, West Africa. This story relates how a European missionary first entered a particular village in eastern Nigeria during the early 1900s and tried to change the peoples from their own traditional African god that served them faithfully for thousands of years for his own god from Europe, of whom these Africans knew nothing. It also deals with the value of the living oracle, prophet in African life, as against the belief in appealing to saints, dead people, in European and European American style Christianity. But the crux of the above dialogue is seen in the fact that the missionary had the audacity to come into eastern Nigeria and condemn the people's God, calling it a piece of wood. He forgot that they could see their God at least, which was more than he could say for his. Moreover, they knew where to find theirs when they wanted his service, but could he find his when he needed service? The dialogue continued along the line that is still commonly used by Christian, Muslim, and other foreign missionaries in their attempt to belittle the traditional gods of Africa, while at the same instance honoring their own gods of Europe, Asia, and the United States of America, Jesus Christ and Allah in particular. In this regard, Mr. Achebe continues, "You say that there is one supreme God who made heaven and earth," said Akuna on one of Mr. Brown's visits. "We also believe in him and call him Chukwu. He made all the world and the other gods." "There are no other gods," said Mr. Brown. "Chukwu is the only God, and all others are false. You carve a piece of wood, etc., etc." Mr. Brown repeated everything he had stated above in this visit. Here, as one looks back at the last 5 paragraphs on page 25, it is seen that the indigenous Africans defended their religions with as much vigor as did the foreign European-style Christian missionaries like Mr. Brown tried to sell theirs. Mr. Achebe continues further in the next paragraphs. "They have a queen," said the interpreter on his own account. "Your queen sends her messenger, the district commissioner. He finds that he cannot do the work alone, and so he appoints Katma to help him. It is the name with God, or Chukwu. He appoints the smaller gods to help him because his work is too great for one person." Not being able to convince Mr. Akuma, the African, that his God, Jesus Christ, was a superior diviner to Chukwu, Mr. Brown, the European from England, resorted to the economic white power which was always available to the colonialist Christian missionaries to whip Africans who would not convert into line. This method, or forced conversion, was always used when missionaries' logic about their European-styled blind Jesus Christ failed to convince and convert the Africans through non-violent persuasion. Mr. Achebe continues, "In this way, Mr. Brown learned a good deal about the religion of the clan, and he came to the conclusion that a frontal attack on it would not succeed, and so he built a school and a little hospital in Umufia. He went from family to family, begging people to send their children to his school, but at first they only sent their slaves or sometimes their lazy children. Mr. Brown begged and argued and prophesied. He said that the leaders of the land in the future would be men and women who had learned to read and write. If Umufia failed to send her children to the school, strangers would come from other places to rule them. They could already see that happening in the native court, where the DC was surrounded by strangers who spoke his tongue. Most of these strangers came from the distant town of Umuru, on the bank of the great river where the white man first went." In the end, Mr. Brown's arguments began to have an effect. More people came and learned in his school, and he encouraged them with gifts of singlets and towels. They were not all young, these people who came to learn. Some of them were 30 years old or more. They worked on their farms in the morning and went to school in the afternoons. And it was not long before the people began to say that the white man's medicine was quick in working. Mr. Brown's school produced quick results. A few months in it were enough to make one a court messenger or a court clerk. Those who stayed longer became teachers, and from Umuofia laborers went forth into the Lord's vineyard. New churches were established in the surrounding villages, and a few schools with them. From the beginning, religion and education went hand in hand. Mr. Brown's mission grew from strength to strength. Because of its link with the new administration, it earned a new social prestige. But Mr. Brown himself was breaking down in health. At first he ignored the warning signs, but in the end, Mr. Brown had to leave his flock, sad and broken. Religion and education went hand in hand. These are the words Mr. Achebe used to describe the manner in which Mr. Brown was able to capture the affectation of the Africans to his God, Jesus Christ. In other words, if the Africans wanted to eat, they had to have the required education and skills of their imposed colonialist masters in the new government. To secure such needed food and educational skills, they were forced to fall into the waiting, outstretched arms of the missionaries whose religion, European-style Christianity, they had rejected. They were caught by the age-old African proverb that says, "Jumping from the log to the fire is a fatal solution to the problem." One is to assume that the European God, Jesus Christ in this specific case, inspired his missionaries to use whatever violation of his Ten Commandments, which Moses was supposed to have received on Mount Sinai, but in fact co-opted from the negative confessions, they felt fitting in any conversion situation, providing it led to the acquisition of new converts. This was the preferred manner in which God, Jesus Christ, and Allah won converts from the gods, Juju, Oludumare, Chukwu, and others in every part of Africa from the beginning of the slave trade to the present late 20th century. However, this method is certainly overshadowed by chattel slavery, when Africans by the millions were beaten into accepting European-style Christianity by their slave masters, many of whom were ordained ministers of the church, many also being captains of slave ships and owners of the same. The most notorious of the slave ship owners and captains was the Reverend John Hawkins of the Church of England, Anglican Church, whose flagship was named Jesus Christ de Lubeck. But one must remember that there was also another European-style missionary, the Most Reverend Bishop Bartolomeo de las Casas of the Roman Catholic Church, who, in circa 1503 or 1506 CE, was responsible for the institution of slave trading from Africa to the New World. The first of such African slaves was shipped to the island of Haiti, which the Spaniards had already named Hispaniola. Looking back to the Reverend Placide Temple's book, Bantu Philosophy, one sees certain fundamentals which are said to be the basis for Juju, Voodoo, Shango, Dambala Quedo, and all other African, European, Asian, and American religions. Yet they cannot be accepted as such by European and European American religionists. Why? Because one man sees the other man's God or religion as being inferior to his own. His God is no better than his own image of himself. If he feels that an African is less than a European or European American, he must also assume that his God must have also made the same conclusion. Therefore, the Jews are the chosen people for Jews and Christian alike. But are they the chosen people for Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Yorubas, or even Christians who claim no Jewish ethnological tie with the so-called Jewish race one hears so much about of? Emphatically not. In conjunction with this point of view, the Reverend Placide Temples noted, quote, "The white man, a new phenomenon in the Bantu world, could be conceived only according to pre-existing categories of Bantu thought. He was, therefore, incorporated into the universe of forces in the position therein which was congruent with the logic of the Bantu ontology. The technological skill of the white man impressed the Bantu. The white man seemed to be the master of great natural forces. It had, therefore, to be admitted that the white man was an elder, a superior human force, surpassing the vital force of all Africans. The vital force of the white man is such that against the manja, or the application of active natural forces as the disposition of Africans, was without effect. End quote. Herein lies a basic error on Temple's part. He obviously underestimated the ethics of the Africans, which he, like all of the other colonialists, called Bantus. Hospitality to all strangers, in which reverence for another's religion is too often mistaken by foreign missionaries as being the African's expression of fear. The same holds true for any foreigner in their midst, who may be able to perform material feats, which they have not yet done. Outlining what he chooses to call the general laws of vital causability, Temples listed the following. 1. Man, living or deceased, can directly reinforce or diminish the being of another man. Such vital influence is possible from man to man. It is indeed necessarily effective as between the progenitor, superior vital force, and his progeny, an inferior force. This interaction does not occur only when the recipient object is endowed, in respect of the endowing subject, with a superior force which he may achieve of himself, or some vital external influence, or especially by the action of God. Footnote: Temples was himself a quote-unquote white man. He was only expressing his own chosen people's myth. Did not the so-called Bantu have a color like the white man? Should the Africans he called Bantus not be called black men? Is it not true that white is as much a color as black? Why this type of racism in religion? End of footnote. 2. The vital human force can directly influence inferior force beings, animals, vegetables, or minerals, in their being itself. 3. A rational being, spirit, names, or living, can indirectly have an effect upon another rational being by communicating his vital influence to an inferior force, animal, vegetable, or mineral, through the intermediary of which it influences the rational being. This influence will also have the character of a necessarily effective action, save only when the object is inherently the stronger force, or is reinforced by the influence of some third party, or preserves himself by recourse to inferior forces exceeding those which his enemy is employing. Temples had to journey all the way to Africa and involve himself in a major study in order that he might understand if there is a philosophical basis for any African traditional religion. Upon what basis could the Africans rest their traditional religions other than a spiritual philosophy? However, Temples type of missionaries are still active in the Harlems of the United States of America, as they are still frequented by so-called Christian and Islamic missionaries, all of whom express freely their utter contempt for the African Americans' right to practice voodoo, magic, and juju as they are presently practiced in the thousands of storefront churches, where oracles, called prophets, chant Christian songs, dispense voodoo herbs, and conduct burnt offerings while they make anointing oils, all of which one can find in the Hebrew, Jewish Torah, Christian Holy Bible, and Muslim Quran. While sweet burnt incense fills the air of the storefront churches, and oracles move into their incantations to communicate with the spirit world, the words are Christian, but the ceremony voodoo. The blessing, of charms and anointment with oils and myrrh, are as much voodooistic as they are Judaic, Christian, or Islamic. The third book of Moses, Leviticus, speaks of the paganistic burnt offerings, which are in every sense the same as in most voodoo, juju, and Shango or Abia feast. Thus Leviticus states, 1. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, When any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of cattle from the herd or from the flock. 3. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall present the blood, and throw the blood around about against the altar, that is, at the door of the tent of meeting. And he shall flay the burnt offering, and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar, and lay wood in order upon the fire. And Aaron's sons, the priest, shall lay the pieces, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the altar. But its entrails and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall burn the whole on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. If his gift for a burnt offering is from the flock, from the sheep or goats, he shall offer a male without blemish, and he shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall throw its blood against the altar around about, and he shall cut it into pieces, with its head and its fat, and the priest shall lay them in order upon the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But the entrails and the legs he shall wash in water, and the priest shall offer the whole, and burn it on the altar, if it is a burnt offering, and offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. In Leviticus, under the law of peace offerings, it is also written, If he brings a lamb as his offering for a sin offering, he shall bring a female without blemish, and lay his hand upon the head of the sin offering, and kill it for a sin offering in the place where they killed the burnt offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, and put it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering, and pour out the rest of its blood at the base of the altar. And all its fat he shall remove, as the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar, upon the offerings by fire to the Lord. And the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin which he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. In the United States of America, palms are still being burned as burnt offerings on Ash Wednesday of each year, and the sign of the crucifix painted with ashes from the palm on the forehead of each of the faithful in a quote-unquote pagan ceremony that is older than the Christian religion. The ceremony of the burnt offering and burnt palms are as old as the origin of its voodoo origin. Just as the sacrifice of the first male lamb of its unblemished mother was an ancient Egyptian ceremonial tradition for cleansing the soul, thousands of years before an Egyptian named Moses even knew he was going to be born, much less receive a set of laws at Mount Sinai. This ceremony is equal to the rooster that is sacrificed to the god Dambala in voodooism, or the god Oludumare of the Yoruba religion, to please his Orishas, minor gods. In the book African Mythology, the author Reverend Godfrey Parinder states that the Dogons of Western Africa, around the bend of the Niger River, south of Tambut, Timbuktu or Timbuktu, have a religion that is comparable in mythology and spirituality to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the so-called Western religions. Explaining the Dogon's religion, which Reverend Parinder said was revealed to him by one of their sages, named Ogetemele, on permission from the elders, headmen, he wrote, "In the beginning of the one God, Amma created the sun and moon like pots. His first invention. The sun is white hot and surrounded by 8 rings of red copper, and the moon is the same shape with rings of white copper. The stars came from pellets of clay that Amma flung into space. To create the earth, he squeezed a lump of clay, as he had done for the stars, and threw it into space. There it spread out flat, with the north at the top, and its members branched out in different directions like the body, lying flat with its face upward. Amma was lonely and drew near to the female earth to unite himself with it, but his passage was barred by a red termite hill. He cut this down, and unison took place, but the interference made it defective, and instead of twins being born, which would have been natural, a jackal was born instead. This jackal was a trouble to him afterwards. The myth justifies female circumcision, which is practiced by the Dogon and many other African peoples. There was further union between God and earth, and twins were born. They were like water and green in color. Their top half was human, and the bottom half snake-like. They had red eyes and forked tongues, sinuous arms without joints, and their bodies covered with short green hair shining like water. They had 8 members and were born perfect. These 2 spirits were called Numo, and they went up to heaven to get instructions from God, since he was their father, and they were made from his essence, which is the life force of the world, from which come all motion and energy. This force is water, and the Numo are in all water, or seas and rivers and storms. In fact, they are water. They are also light and emit it constantly. When the Numo spirits looked down from the sky, they saw Mother Earth, naked and in disorder. So they came down, bringing the bunches of fibers from heavenly plants, which they made into 2 bunches to clothe the earth in front and behind like a woman. The fibers were moist of the essence of the Numo spirits. By means of this clothing, the earth obtained a language, elementary but sufficient for the beginning. The jackal, deceitful firstborn of God, was jealous of his mother's possession of language. He seized the fiber skirt in which the language was embodied. The earth resisted this sinful attack and hid in her own womb, symbolized as an ant hill in which she changed into an ant. The jackal pursued her, and although the earth dug down deep, she was not able to escape. The jackal seized his mother's skirt, gained the power of speech, and so he is able to reveal the plans of the Supreme Being to diviners. The result of this unfilial attack was the defilement of the earth, and Amma decided to create live beings without her. But when he had formed their organs, the Numo spirits saw there was a danger of twin births disappearing. So they drew a male and a female outline on the ground, on top of one another, and so it was, and has been ever since, that every human being has 2 souls at first. Man is bisexual, but a man's female soul is removed at circumcision, and the corresponding event happens to a woman at excision. The myth continues with the coming of the first man, and though they still refer back to God, They will be considered later under a separate heading. Meanwhile, the gifts of God to man occur in a number of myths. If the above story, with all of its universality in the explanation of man's origin, is a myth, what is the story about Adam and Eve and creation in the first book of Moses, Genesis, following, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and separated the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called the firmament heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. And God said, Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, upon the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which there is seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day. The story continues with the making of light, seasons, stars, birds, sea monsters, other living creatures, etc. But in verse 24, it begins to take on animals and other forms which man deals with daily, thus the making of cattle, man, etc. And God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the cattle to their kinds, and everything that creeps upon the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Following the creation of everything else, the Jewish Jehovah, Christian Jesus Christ, and Muslim Allah, with the help of one or more persons, created man, called Adam, according to the following. Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our own likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a sixth day. Still not satisfied with what he had already created, God decided to create a woman called Eve for his Adam. The act continues in the following manner, according to the story. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat of it you shall die. Then the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. So out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all cattle, and to the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs, and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, This at least is bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother, and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed. From this point on, many things happen, but the most important, so far as this citation is concerned, a serpent tempted Eve, etc., in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve then ate the forbidden fruit. They found out they were naked and covered their nakedness. God followed by chasing them from the Garden of Eden. Eve repeatedly became pregnant and delivered her 3 oldest children, all sons. Thus Cain and Abel. The former killed the latter and was driven from the Garden of Eden into the land of Nod, east of Eden, etc., where he knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. This entire drama did not in any way include Eve's third son, Seth. Strangely enough, God must have made more people beside Adam and Eve elsewhere in order for Cain to have found himself a wife when he arrived in Nod. It could not have been his mother, the only woman in the world at the time according to the story, because she was not banished with him, and she did not have any daughter up to the time of Cain's banishment. Before analyzing these myths, the creation of man by another god should be examined. For this, Jomo Kenyatta, long before becoming president of the Republic of Kenya, East Africa, wrote the following in the most authoritative book on the subject entitled Facing Mount Kenya. It is a deep-searching anthropological work with which he tried to acquaint Europeans and European Americans of the traditions, beliefs, and customs of his own ethnic grouping, the Gaikuyu people. He wrote, The conception of deity. The Gaikuyu believes in one God, Nagai, the creator and giver of all things. He has no father, mother, or companion of any kind. His work is done in solitude. He loves or hates people according to their behavior. The creator lives in the sky. But his temporary homes on earth, situated on the mountains, where he may rest during his visits. The visits are made with a view to carrying out a kind of general inspection, and to bring blessings and punishments to the people. The common name used in speaking of the Supreme Being is Nagai. This name is used by 3 neighboring tribes, the Maasai, the Gaikuyu, and Wakamba. In prayers and sacrifices, Nagai is addressed by the Gaikuyu as Mwene Nyaga, possessor of brightness. This name is associated with Kere Nyaga, the Gaikuyu name for Mount Kenya, which means that which possesses brightness, or mountain of brightness. The mountain of brightness is believed by the Gaikuyu to be the Nagai's official resting place, and in their prayers they turn towards Kere Nagai, and with their hands raised toward it, they offer their sacrifices, taking the mountain to be the holy earthly dwelling place of Nagai. The being thus described cannot be seen by ordinary mortal eyes. He is a distant being, and takes but little interest in individuals in their daily walks of life. Yet, at the crisis of their lives, he is invariably called upon. At the birth, initiation, marriage, and death of every Gaikuyu, communication is established on his behalf with Ngai. The ceremonies for these four events leave no doubt as to the importance of the spiritual assistance which is essential to them. Of the Gaikuyu's holy place, which is the equivalent indeed of any Hebrew synagogue, Christian church, or Islamic mosque, Mr. Kenyatta wrote, apart from the official abode of Mwene Nayaga at Kere Nayaga on the north, there are minor homes such as the Kia Njahe, the mountain of the big rain, on the east, Kia Mbiro Ioro, the mountain of clear sky, on the south, Kia Nyandarara, the mountain of sleeping place or hides, on the west. All these are regarded with reverence as great places and mysteries symbolic of God. The Gaikuyu, who has no temple made with hands, selects huge trees, generally mogumo or motamayo and mokoyo trees, which symbolize the mountains. Under these trees he worships and makes his sacrifices to Mwene Mayaga. These sacred trees are regarded in the same manner as most Christians regard churches, as the house of God. On the origin of the Gaikuyu people, Mr. Kenyatta stated, according to the tribal legend, we are told that in the beginning of things, when mankind started to populate the earth, the man, Gaikuyu, the founder of the tribe, was called by the Mogai, the divider of the universe, and was given as his share the land with the ravines, the rivers, the forest, the game, and all the gifts that the Lord of Nature, Mogai, bestowed on mankind, which he called Kere Nayaga, Mount Kenya, as the resting place when on inspection tour, and as a sign of his wonders. He then took the man Gaikuyu to the top of the mountain of mystery and showed him the beauty of the country that Mogai had given him. While still on the top of the mountain, the Mogai pointed out to Gaikuyu a spot full of fig trees, Makoyo, right in the center of the country. After the Mogai had shown Gaikuyu the panorama of the wonderful land he had been given, he commanded him to descend and establish his homestead on the selected place, which he named Mokowe. Before they parted, Mogai told Gaikuyu that whenever he was in need, he should make a sacrifice and raise his hands toward Kere Neaga, the mountain of mystery, and the Lord of Nature will come to his assistance. Gaikuyu did as he was commanded by the Magai, and when he reached the spot, he found that the Mogai had provided him with a beautiful wife, whom Gaikuyu named Mumbai, creator or molder. Both lived happily and had 9 daughters and no sons. Gaikuyu was very disturbed at not having a male heir. In his despair, he called upon the Mogai to advise him on the situation. He responded quickly and told Gaikuyu not to be perturbed, but to have patience, and everything would be done according to his wish. He then commanded him, saying, go and take 1 lamb and 1 kid from your flock. Kill them under the fig tree near your homestead. Pour the blood and the fat of the 2 animals on the trunk of the tree. Then you and your family make a big fire under the tree and burn the meat as a sacrifice to me, your benefactor. When you have done this, take home your wife and daughters. After that, go back to the sacred tree, and there you will find 9 handsome young men who are willing to marry your daughters, under any condition that will please you and your family. Gaikuyu did as he was directed by the Mogai, and so it happened that when Gaikuyu returned to the sacred tree, there he found the promised 9 young men who greeted him warmly. For a few moments he could not utter a word, for he was overwhelmed with joy. When he had recovered from his emotional excitement, he took the 9 youths to his homestead and introduced them to his family. The strangers were entertained and hospitably treated according to the social custom. A ram was killed, and a millet gruel prepared for their food. While this was being made ready, the youths were taken to a stream nearby to wash their tired limbs. After this, they had their meal and conversed merrily with the family, and then went to bed. Early the next morning, Gaikuyu rose and woke the young men to have their morning meal with him. When they finished eating, the question of marriage was discussed. Gaikuyu told the young men that if they wished to marry his daughters, he could give his consent only if they agreed to live in his homestead under a matriarchal system. The young men agreed to this condition, for they could not resist the beauty of the Gaikuyu daughters, nor the kindness which the family had shown them. This pleased the parents, for they knew that their lack of sons was not going to be recompensed. The daughters, too, were pleased to have male companions, and after a short time all of them were married, and soon established their own family sets. These were joined together under the name of Mabari Ya Moambi, i.e., Mumbi's family group, in honor of their mother, Muimbi. The 9 small families continued to live together with their parents, Gaikuyu and Muambi, acting as the heads of the Mabari Ya Moambi. As time went on, each family increased rapidly, and Gaikuyu and Muambi had many grand and great-grandchildren. When Gaikuyu and Muambi died, their daughters inherited their movable and immovable property, which they shared equally among them. Further examination of other indigenous traditional African religions should not be necessary at this time. One should be able at this point to observe that the extent of mythology regarding quote-unquote creation within African religions is no more or no less than within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet, no one in either religion would concede that the other is as much God created as his or hers. Why? Because of man's drive to be the quote master of all he surveys. As such, all that he is associated with must be superior to that of others who do not belong to his in-group. The biological explanation of how a son came to the family of Muambi, according to the Gaikuyu, is not only logical, but modern in its application for 20th century thinking man. It certainly bears more to reality than God taking earth or clay and molding man into existence. But the Gaikuyu story is supposedly mythological paganism, whereas the earth and clay story of the Jews and Christians, and also Muslims, is God-inspired words passed down through his holy prophets and writers. At least these are the teachings one hears from the earthly representatives of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Why? Because of the same egotism mentioned before, along with its natural outgrowth, modern racism, that infiltrated and corrupted them to the extent that God is seen in terms of black and white. Since each theologian is within his own authoritative rights to interpret the alleged holy words of God, that is, depending upon which God is being used at the time, the holy words can say anything the exhorter desires God to have said. Inevitably, the following question always arises. If Jesus Christ is not the only one and true God, then why are so many people Christians? Of course, this question worked the other way when there was no Jesus Christ. Then there must have been no Christian God. But amongst Christians, this type of logic is confusing and therefore sacrilegious. If sacrilegious, it is more than likely pagan. The premise of a good or bad, true or false religion is the cardinal problem which makes it almost impossible for many researchers to report freely and without bias on their findings about the traditional African gods within voodoo, juju, obia, magic, witchcraft, and all other traditional African religions relegated to animism by European and European American style Christian religionists, Jewish chosen people, and Muslim jihadists and other paternal and maternal protectors of their African and African American Negro children. This must be done, of course, because people of African origin supposedly lack the necessary capacity of the large brain which is only to be found in Caucasians of Europe and European America. At least, this seems to be the basic premise upon which traditional African religions have been degraded by most who now label themselves Westerners in place of their formerly prestigious Caucasians. Upon further examination of the Dogon's god, one noted that in the creation of heaven and earth, clay was also used. But according to the same Dogons, man was not made from clay, but, quote, the stars came from pellets of clay that Amma, God, flung into space. It is further revealed that, quote, Amma was lonely and drew near to the female earth to unite himself with it. The same sexual relationship between God and a female existed in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as seen in the following. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, etc. Obviously, God would not likely make man in his own image with another male, but this traditional myth seems to be common among Western peoples. Whether or not the traditional African religions, quote unquote, us as animal or thing, it is always female. This so-called primitive or pagan rationalization was, and still is, said to be naturally instinctive, and no high degree of academic sophistication was necessary for ancient man to have deduced such a rationale. Yet, everywhere in Africa, original man is shown to have had a mother. The concept of sacred trees within the religions of the Yorubas of Nigeria, Kikuyu of Kenya, and Bundus of Angola, Twa, the so-called pygmies of the Congo and Burundi, are embodied with soul, because trees do eat, move, and do other things like most animals, man included. As such, most indigenous Africans recognize them as having spirit. This is the reason some Africans can be seen praying for forgiveness whenever they must cut down a tree. This custom gives rise to the reason why most Christian missionaries from Europe and European America mistakenly assume that Africans worship trees. A spirit is not paganistic when Westerners apply it to man. Yet it is when Africans suggest that there is a spirit world in which their ancestors enter after death and which guard them. If God is a spirit, at times that man is the spitting image of God, then one should easily see why ancestors became spirits in African traditional religions. Obviously, the Africans seem to be employing the same mythological concepts built into the so-called Western religions as written, whereas most Europeans, European Americans, Jews and Christians, and Asians, Muslims, would prefer that said paganistic customs could be extracted from their own religion's holy book. But to do this would leave Christianity, Judaism, and Islam without saints, spirits, prophets, ghosts, angels, and a host of other fantastics which are so commonly found within voodoo, juju, magic, and the entire gamut of what is being called African paganism and animism. And of course, one cannot forget the much more usual terms, heathenism and cannibalism.